What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back with another Four Corners video breaking down tonight's very intimate two-game NBA slate, courtesy of Awesemo.com. Now, as I mentioned, it's a two-game slate, so we're going to have to dig deep today to find some picks that'll help us get ahead of the tournament fields. So make sure to like this video right now, leave a comment down below, tell me which random guy, talking the Jake Laymans, the Seth Currys of the world, the Pat Connaughtons, which of those guys you like the most on today's slate. I'll, of course, jump in later, answer any questions, and talk with you guys, so like the video right now and leave a comment. First corner I want to hit on is a game of the Thunder visiting the Blazers, and this one has a slate high, 234 points, a big accomplishment with just two games, and it represents a 5.4 point boost for Portland. CJ McCollum projects to be the highest owned Blazer right now at 60%, according to our ownership projections at Awesemo.com. He's only shot 13 times in the last two games, and the hope is that the pace-up spot here versus the Thunder should get him a little more looks here, but I'm not super confident in CJ McCollum at 60%. I think if he does have a big outlier day, you're going to want to be close to that number, but 60% feels a little bit high for me given what we know of CJ McCollum and how limited his upside can be if his shot isn't falling and he's not getting enough volume. Damian Lillard looks to be a lower owned option, and he's had 54.25 and 60.75 fantasy point days versus Oklahoma City this year. He's also had a 37.5 fantasy point day, so it's not all sunshine and rainbows for Damian Lillard, but I think he looks like a better play with some more upside than CJ McCollum. I think both guys are fine, but I'd prefer the lower ownership Lillard play if we were making one lineup. Yusuf Nurkic has been a better matchup versus Steven Adams than you would think. He's been over 40.5 fantasy points versus the Thunder this year in 2 out of 3 matchups. I think he looks like a decent play. His price is down enough where he could have some upside, so I don't mind him here. I also think that Enes Kanter, not a terrible play behind him, obviously a good per minute guy, not seeing a ton of minutes, and if for some reason Nurkic faltered, you would see Kanter have a pretty nice day. Al-Farouq Aminu seems like a tough player for me to parse out today because I think he's in a decent spot. He projects well for me, but half the field's going to be on him, and Aminu really hasn't shown a ton of upside. It's a pace-up spot. You could also see some rebounding for him increase because you're going to have both Yusuf Nurkic and Steven Adams fighting for the board. Adams might do his thing where he just keeps Nurkic off the boards and allows some other guys to get some rebounds instead. So I think it could be a spot where Aminu's upside could rise there, but I'd be just as happy going to Mo Harkless at 20% less ownership. He's shown a lot more upside recently. Jake Layman as well off the bench, going to be lower owned, and he does score quite a bit, and he could rest some minutes away from the other wing players, so I would be a little bit lower owned than what the field projects to be right now for Al-Farouq Aminu. Russell Westbrook is projected for just 32% ownership, and that's despite putting up a 61.1 fantasy point average versus Portland in 3 games so far this year. So I like Westbrook quite a bit. It's a matchup where it's going to be a pace down for the Thunder, but I think that's perfectly fine here. He's also looked better with Paul George back in the lineup. A bit of a surprise, but Westbrook is benefiting a bit from that separated floor with George being able to spread guys out a little bit more. So I like Westbrook here, and I think his ownership just seems way too low. Paul George put up 88.5 fantasy points the last time that he met the Trailblazers in a 47-point, 12-board, 10-assist game, and he also has averaged 68.5 fantasy points in all 3 games that the Thunder have played versus the Blazers. So I think this is a good spot for Paul George. He's going to be pretty highly owned and definitely higher owned than Russell Westbrook, so I think I might be inclined to go George and Westbrook if I can find a way to afford them. I think that's probably the move to make here, but George's ceiling obviously pretty high. His usage still pretty high, even though he hasn't had a big outlier day recently since some shoulder issues. And I think he's worth matching the field on if he is going to be owned by about 50% of the people. Steven Adams hasn't been great versus Portland this year, but he has averaged 37.25 fantasy points over his last 3 games, so that's a decent spot for Steven Adams with how he's looked recently, but I don't love the matchup versus Nurkic, and I do think he may end up playing a spot where he ends up just keeping Nurkic off the board, trying to limit the damage while the other guys do a lot of the work. And Jeremy Grant and Dennis Schroeder are still in consideration because it is such a short slate. If these guys spike an upside day, it could be an important part to have in a tournament. Dennis Schroeder, they're still a little bit overpriced to me. He's priced for where he was with Paul George out when he was seeing upwards of 40 minutes, also a ton of usage. So I think Dennis Schroeder is still a bit too high priced. Jeremy Grant, I prefer a little bit. Not a great spot for either guy, but Grant would be my preferred play out of the two. Next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Pacers visiting the Bucks. This must be a big shock to you if you're not good with process of elimination. This one has a 223 combined total, which represents a 2.2 point decrease for Indiana and a slight 0.8 point decrease for Milwaukee. Thad Young currently projects to be the highest owned guy in this game at 56% expected ownership. He's had a 57.75 fantasy point day, but he's also had 20.25 and 9.25 fantasy point days versus Milwaukee this year. Neither of those are that great, obviously, but I think that Thad Young is a guy who I would consider to be a stable play today, but I don't think he's going to have that 57.75 upside again. A lot of rebounds in that game, also some assist upside that he had as well. I don't think that's a spot here, so Thad Young, I'd be comfortable going under the field on. Bogdanovich and Wesley Matthews should get some looks from deep given the fact the Bucks are allowing a league-high 35 three-point attempts per game. Bogdan's averaged 36.1 fantasy points since the All-Star break, which looks good, but I do think he's going to get a lot of defensive attention because he's been a pretty good scorer lately. I think the Bucks are going to sniff that out and try to crowd him a little bit more. Wesley Matthews, though, an interesting play to me. He hasn't gotten over 30 fantasy points since joining Indiana so far, but he's averaging 7.93 attempts per game. in his last 7. And that's, to me, is where you're going to want to look at here, because again, this Bucks team is allowing the attempts. If those shots fall for Wesley Matthews, you could have an outlier day and not a lot of ownership. Miles Turner's also had 142.25 fantasy point day versus the Bucks this year. He can stretch the floor. I think the fact that he got 22 shots in that game could be a similar situation today, where we see him just able to show his long distance game a little bit more than he does otherwise, because they're going to key in on the better shooters. Miles Turner, if you take 10 3 attempts for Miles Turner, it's not something the Bucks are going to worry about, even though it could go his way if Turner does hit those shots. So I like Turner quite a bit, though. Again, the foul trouble a real risk with how Giannis will dive towards the hole with reckless abandon. Darren Collison had 32 fantasy points last time versus Milwaukee, and I think that's about where I'd expect him to be today. I think he does have some assist upside if those other guys are shooting well, so if, like, let's say Brogdon does well, you're going to see some assists for Collison there. Wesley Matthews as well, if he did well alongside Brogdon, I think that would also help Collison out. So I think Collison's a decent play, but I'd be more inclined to play him if I were playing other Pacers who rely on him to score. Giannis Antetokounmpo had 82.25 fantasy points last time he played Indiana. He's also had a low of 35.5 fantasy points in the matchup right before that, so I think that's sort of what Giannis is, sort of a boom-bust guy. The fact that he got up to 34 minutes last game bodes well with his minutes restriction, some issues with his knees recently, but I think he looks pretty good here. I prefer Russell Westbrook at a little bit less money on DraftKings, but I think those guys are close, and I think having some exposure to Giannis does make sense because he could spike that 80-point ceiling once again. Chris Middleton currently projects to be the highest owned buck at 41%, and I'm not crazy about it. I think Middleton's a fine play, but I like him more when you have less bodies in the rotation than they currently have. Everybody's healthy for this one, so I'm not crazy about Middleton. Same thing applies for Malcolm Brogdon. He hasn't had over 40 fantasy points since November 28th. That's a lot of time without a guy spiking a big ceiling day. So Middleton and Brogdon I think are fine, but I would prefer them more in cash, where you know that you're going to just want that floor that's going to be steady. I don't think the upside is really there for either guy in this matchup. Eric Bledsoe has a high of 42.5 fantasy points versus Indiana this year. I think he's got more of a ceiling than Middleton and Brogdon, so I don't mind Bledsoe here. I think you could definitely see him have a floor day as well. Wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world, but Bledsoe in a competitive game I think has been bringing it more often than not, so Bledsoe would be my guy out of those ancillary pieces for the Bucks. Brook Lopez has shot 10 or more three-point attempts in the last 2 games versus Indiana. Those shots should be there again for him today if he wants to take them, and I think he will because that's just what he does. So Brook Lopez, an okay play to me, and again, lower owned than these other guys, so I think he does interest me quite a bit from that perspective as well. McCollum Mirotic's steady bench run for the Bucks is something to note. Again, it's a short slate, so if he does spike an upside day, you might need him in your lineup to win a tournament. So Mirotic is a guy I'd like. I'd prefer him to Pat Connaughton, the same ownership. Pat Connaughton, we saw his floor just last game. He had 21 minutes and got 0 fantasy points, just did nothing. I think put up 1 shot, just not a great look for Pat Connaughton overall. He can have those 20 plus fantasy point days. So I'd rather go to a guy like Mirotic, who we know is going to get his shots. We know he's going to rebound a little. He's going to do some things on the court. I think Ersan Ilyasova is in play too. He's averaging 22.4 fantasy points in his last 4 games coming off the bench. And the spacing that Mirotic provides has been helping out Ilyasova, allowing him to function more inside as well, spreading himself outside when Mirotic goes inside. So they've been a good 1-2 punch off the bench. I think a guy like Ilyasova interests me more too. Pat Connaughton, though, I'm not seeing it, and if he's going to be owned by a quarter of the field, I think that might just be wasted lineups for those guys. And this guy didn't make the slide, but I'm just going to throw him in there because he could spike an upside here. Again, the Bucks just allowing a ton of 3-point attempts per game. Tyreek Evans off the bench interests me this much. I think he's an okay play, a guy who could spike a ceiling day if something broke his way. Let's say the Pacers are not hitting their shots in the first unit, they have to score somewhere, and the Bucks are going to allow them to shoot from deep, and that could be where Evans gets going. But you got to look at these guys today because one of these 1%, 5% owned guys can be the difference between you finishing first in the tournament and finishing 500th. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on today's abridged NBA slate, though the video itself not as abridged as it should be, but you got to talk about all these dudes because there's so many options out there. And again, you got to really dig deep today on a slate like this, find some guys who may be lower owned and hope they go off. We've seen some big success from this video. Yesterday's video, I got a lot of people telling me they did well in part because of some of the people I put them on at low ownership, including Luka and Devin Booker. So help me out now. Keep the momentum going. Like the video right now. Leave a comment. Again, tell me which guy of these crappy guys we talked about, the Pat Connaughtons of the world, who you think might be the best play tonight. Throw it in the comments below. I'll jump in later, answer any questions, and talk it up with you guys. And of course, use that promo code SWITCH and HEDGE. I'm going to do the same hand gesture again I did yesterday. I need to think of different hand gestures every day to promote this, but you get 50% off your first month at Osmo.com with that promo code right here. Ooh, so great, this promo code. Switch and Hedge will get you 50% off your first month at Osmo.com. All the ownership projections and rankings from Osmo, who is the top player in the world across a variety of sports. So check that out now. Use the promo code Switch and Hedge. And I'll be back in tomorrow with a more robust NBA slate. So good luck.